Today is early July 3rd, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to start, as I usually do, by taking a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind when we look at it. But when you do look at this pro-Ukrainian map, you can see that the line of contact between today and the beginning of Ukraine's long-awaited offensive about a month ago now remains relatively unchanged. We do see a little bit of progress here north of Tokmak, and we see this area right here, heavy fighting taking place, and a little bit of progress made by the Ukrainians taking these villages. All of this is taking place in Russia's security zone ahead of the first of several lines of main defensive positions. And if we go to the Donbas region, we see Ukrainian forces fighting around Bakhmut and Seversk. But again, the progress has been minimum, and Bakhmut still remains under Russian control. But I will talk more about Bakhmut a little bit later. I want to remind people of the nature of Russian defenses, and I'm going to go back to this December 2022 New York Times article. It's titled "Defenses Carved into the Earth. Russia is building a vast network of trenches, traps, and obstacles to slow Ukraine's momentum. Will it work?" Apparently, at least for an entire month into Ukraine's offensive, it has worked. And it says, this satellite image shows newly built Russian fortifications near one of the deadliest front lines of the war in Ukraine. And this is near Popasnia. East of Bakhmut, there are multiple layers of defenses about midway between Bakhmut and Popasnia. And as you go through the article, you're going to see a lot of maps and diagrams. You will see that Russia has concentrated layered defenses in the south, in Kherson and Zaporozhye, north of Crimea, and again in the Donbas region, east of Bakhmut near Popasnaya. They show the tank traps, the dragon's teeth. They have a diagram here. They've got pillboxes, trenches. There's going to be anti-tank weapons in these trenches. And all of this is protected by a security zone with mobile Russian defenses and minefield after minefield after minefield. And this, by the way, is in December of last year. Many months have passed since then, and Russian defenses have only gotten thicker and more extensive. So this is Bakhmut right here, and Popasnia here, and all of these defenses in between. Ukraine still has to drag its forces across or around Bakhmut before they even reach these defenses. Likewise, in the south, this is from just Melitopol to Crimea, all of these defensive lines between Melitopol and Crimea. And since then, Russia has built layers upon layers between Melitopol and the line of contact to the north. Between the current line of contact and Crimea, there are almost 200 kilometers worth of layered defenses. Even from the current line of contact to, say, Mariupol, or anywhere along the coast, it is at least around 100 kilometers of defenses that Ukraine is going to have to breach. They, 1 month into their offensive, have not even reached the first line of defenses. As I have said, these defenses are layered for a reason. They are meant to absorb Ukrainian attacks, and Russian forces are meant to move back to successive layers behind them. They're meant to fall back and absorb the Ukrainian offensive. They are designed to give way to Ukrainian forces rather than suffer heavy losses or risk being encircled and captured. That is the whole point of layering your defenses. And yet Russia has not even had to, 1 month, again, 1 month into the offensive, they have not had to fall back to the layers of defense further back. They're not even up to the actual first layer of defense yet. And I want to talk about Bakhmut. I have said many times before Ukraine launched this offensive, I said that there is a possibility that perhaps Ukraine would try to retake Bakhmut. It has only recently been taken by Russian forces. They have not had a lot of time to consolidate control over the city or to build this same type of extensive defenses around it or in it. And so Ukrainian forces might be tempted to focus one part of this offensive on encircling or taking Bakhmut. Of course, Russian forces would, again, if Russian commanders were consistent with what they've done up until now, they will withdraw Russian forces. They will not risk being encircled. They will give up Bakhmut. The whole point of Bakhmut from the very beginning, when Russian Commander General Sergei Surovikin was talking about Bakhmut before the operation began, they said the whole point was attrition, grinding down Ukrainian forces, not necessarily taking the city. I think it was more of an idea amongst Prigozhin of Wagner and some of his associates. I think that was their project, taking the city. It was not an important city for Russia to take. It is not an important city at this point for Russia to hold. They are focused primarily on absorbing and defeating the offensive and reducing Ukraine's offensive potential down to zero. That is their objective, not holding territory, at least especially not holding Bakhmut. It will be a huge PR victory for Ukraine because they will present to the world, the Western media will be more than happy to seize on that as a supposed success. However, to take Bakhmut, they're going to, again, have to rake their forces across the city or around it to the north and south to push Russian forces out of the area, and by doing so, they are going to suffer catastrophic losses. And they are suffering catastrophic losses. The offensive is not going the way that they wanted, and the first bit of evidence to confirm this, again, this all comes from the Western media. Let's look at this Washington Post article. Many others have been talking about this. This is June 30th, 2023. Ukraine's top general, Valery Zaluzhny, wants shells, planes, and patience. Well, if you're in the middle of an offensive, any shells or planes that end up on their way to Ukraine are not going to arrive on time. If you go through this article, the one part I really want to point out here is toward the beginning, where it says, in a rare, wide-ranging interview with the Washington Post, Zaluzhny expressed frustration that while his biggest Western backers would never launch an offensive without air superiority, Ukraine still has not received modern fighter jets, but is expected to rapidly take back territory from the occupying Russians. American-made F-16s, promised only recently, are not likely to arrive until the fall in a best-case scenario, and even if they arrived last fall, they still would not have helped Ukraine in this offensive. It would have ended up like the rest of Ukraine's air force, destroyed with only a handful of aircraft, flying an insignificant number of sorties per day or even per week, firing a minimum amount of ordnance that will disrupt anything Russia is doing. It continues, it says, his troops also should be firing at least as many artillery shells as their enemy, Zaluzhny said, that have been outshot tenfold at times because of limited resources. And we have been talking about this for months and months and months, about artillery shell production, about the importance of artillery in this type of warfare, the fact that Russia is producing more artillery shells now than the US and Europe combined. As a matter of fact, Russia is producing more artillery shells now than the US and Europe combined after they expand production over the next 1 to 3 years. That's how lopsided it is, and that's how lopsided it will remain throughout the duration of this conflict. I'm going to get into this part about Zaluzhny complaining about lacking air power and attempting to carry out this offensive nonetheless. I'm going to get into that in just a bit. I just want to go over another article, recent article. This is from the U.S. government-funded and Western corporate and financier-funded Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Russia isn't going to run out of missiles. This is dated June 28th, 2023, but this is something a lot of people have been saying, again, for months they've been saying this. And the article says Russia's continued strike campaign in 2023 has made one thing quite clear. It is unrealistic to expect Russia to ever run out of missiles. Despite sanctions and export controls, it appears likely that Russia will be able to produce or otherwise acquire the long-range strike capacity necessary to inflict significant damage upon Ukraine's people, economy, and military. And then, of course, CSIS tries to suggest this. It says Ukraine's air defenses have performed remarkably well under challenging circumstances. Nevertheless, the Russian military has continued trying to identify gaps and seems to exploit to gain an advantage. There is no one-off fix for this problem. Sanctions and export controls can, at most, limit the quantity and quality of strike assets Russia can acquire. The most reliable counter is sustained Western support for Ukrainian air defense forces for the duration of the conflict. The continued steady provision of air defenses into the foreseeable future will save lives, reduce costs of future reconstruction, and help end the war more quickly by enabling Ukraine's counteroffensive in the face of superior Russian air power. This is all fantasy. If the U.S. has a shortage, a scarcity of something as simple as artillery shells, you could only imagine the sort of shortage they're facing in terms of advanced air defense systems. First of all, the West has for decades neglected the development of its air defense capabilities. It also has completely neglected its military-industrial capacity to churn out launchers and interceptors. Once Ukraine's Soviet-era air defense systems were exhausted and eliminated off the battlefield, the West faced the problem of being unable to replace them in the quantity and quality necessary just to match what Ukraine had at the end of February 2022 when the special military operation began. So this is another problem. Artillery shells, air defenses, no air power, the prospect of sending F-16s, which are no more or less capable than what Ukraine started this conflict out with. All of these problems mount up to what? To a war of attrition that the West is incapable of winning. What about the Ukrainian offensive itself? We're 1 month in. How is it going? And just to give people an idea of what the expectations were at the beginning versus where it actually is right now, I'd like to show you these two articles. Both of these articles are from Forbes. Both of them are from David Axe. This one is dated June 13th, 2023, toward the beginning of the offensive, and the title is Borrowing Tactics from U.S. Army, the Ukrainian Marine Corps is thundering through Russian lines in fast-moving columns. At no point during the Ukrainian offensive did this ever happen. And the article says, Ukrainian forces are advancing along 3 or 4 axes in southern Ukraine, Zaporozhye and Donetsk oblasts. On the axis running along the Mokry Yali River, Ukrainians aren't just advancing, they're thundering. I don't know where he got this impression. Rolling fast along the unpaved roads, threading north to south from the town of Velka Novosilka toward Makarivka. 10 miles away, the Ukrainian Navy's 35th Marine Brigade has borrowed a tactic from the U.S. Army. In April 2003, early in the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, a battalion from the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division combined 29 M1 tanks, 14 M2 fighting vehicles, and several M113 armored personnel carriers into an urban assault task force and rolled straight into Baghdad days ahead of a planned multi-brigade coalition attack on the city. Now, this analysis by analogy, historical analogy, is very important. The U.S. fighting in Iraq during Desert Storm and during the 2003 invasion is often used as the gold standard of Western military tactics and strategy, and they're trying to apply that to this conflict in Ukraine, which is disastrous. We could see that it's disastrous. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And it says, Colonel Eric Schwartz, who led the so-called Thunder Run, reasoned that a small, fast-moving armored force would confuse and demoralize Baghdad's Iraqi defenders and perhaps preempt a slow, bloody, block-by-block slog across the city. Schwartz was right. His battalion Thunder Run on April 5th breached Baghdad and killed potentially hundreds of Iraqi troops and paramilitaries at the cost of a single American killed in action. A bigger Thunder Run 2 days later was costlier for Americans, but ended with U.S. forces securing a major lodgment in downtown Baghdad, greatly accelerating the city's fall. 20 years later, the Ukrainian 35th Marine Brigade is more than a week into its own prolonged thunder run along the Mortki-Yali River. In 8 or 9 days of hard fighting, the 2,000-person brigade has liberated several villages, most recently Makarivka on Monday. Now, none of this, as Forbes has reported, actually happened. Yes, Ukraine did take several villages, but again, this is all happening in Russia's security zone. This is an area where Russia is mounting mobile defenses. They're not concerned about holding villages. They're concerned with destroying Ukrainian men and machines as they try to cross the security zone toward Russia's first defensive lines. That's what this is all about. Ukraine, again, has not even reached that first defensive line yet because of this mobile defense in the security zone that Russia has mounted. Now, that was June 13th. Same exact author, writing for Forbes, David Axe, June 27th, 2023. 25 tanks and fighting vehicles gone in a blink. The Ukrainian defeat near Malatokmaka was worst than we thought. I think he meant worse than we thought. I think Forbes needs to hire better editors. And it says, an attempt by the Ukrainian Army's 47th Assault Brigade and 33rd Mechanized Brigade to cross a minefield in southern Ukraine on June 8th was even more disastrous than we knew. Analysts recently have tallied even more wrecked and abandoned 47th Brigade M2 infantry fighting vehicles. These are the Bradleys they're talking about, by the way, when they say M2. At the same time, a Ukrainian photographer on or before Saturday got close enough to the site of the failed assault to snap photos of the Russian minefield that trapped the Ukrainian battle group, ultimately destroying dozens of 47th and 33rd Brigades' best Western-made vehicles and killing or wounding many Ukrainians. And this is just one of many botched Ukrainian assaults trying to cross these minefields and failing utterly. And because of these many botched, disastrous assaults on these minefields, this is where Ukraine is right now. This is via the Wall Street Journal. Ukraine hits Russian defenses from a distance before risking troops. With ground counteroffensive stalled, Kiev tries to interrupt the Kremlin's supply line and degrade its forces. So far from thundering anywhere, this is where Ukraine actually is after losing huge numbers of men and equipment during the opening phase, the first month really of this offensive. This is what the Wall Street Journal says. After encountering stiff Russian resistance to their initial ground assault earlier this month, Ukrainian commanders have largely held off sending large infantry formations and Western tanks to assault Russian positions. Instead, Kiev is making targeted strikes, trying to soften Russian defenses for the next attack. Ukrainian forces are using long-range Western weapons to hit Russian supply lines deep in occupied territory. Last week, British cruise missiles struck a key bridge that the Kremlin used to move supplies from Crimea, which Moscow seized in 2014, to the front lines in southern Ukraine. This is debatable that that bridge was strategically important. Even if it is, it's not as if Russia is not going to be able to reroute supplies. But they are also trying to degrade the first lines of Moscow's defenses along the front, using cheap weaponry to hit Russian artillery pieces, ammunition depots, and electronic jammers, and mapping which fields are mined. They have also continued probing attacks, retaking the village of Rivnopol this week, although some other forays yielded little. And again, all in the security zone, not even reaching the first line of Russian defenses, which again, Russia has designed to absorb the Ukrainian offensive. They are designed for Russia to hold them for a certain amount of time and then fall back to the next and the next until the entire Ukrainian offensive potential has been reduced to zero. Then it admits Ukrainian forces haven't yet approached the defenses Russians have constructed, including anti-tank trenches and other barriers about a dozen miles behind the front lines. The offensive isn't going very fast because we're trying to save the troops, said a 49-year-old member of Volkov's drone team. It takes some time to prepare the ground. We need to destroy as much as possible before sending troops in. Now, here a couple of points. First of all, because the New York Times told us back in December of last year, we knew about these significant and layered Russian defenses. We knew that they constructed huge defensive positions all along the line of contact. The New York Times was showing us photographs of them, satellite images, photographs on the ground. They even drew diagrams of these defenses. And of course, they would have included minefields. Now, there are only two ways to get through a minefield. You can just send men and machinery down a certain path, them getting blown up and dying, but eventually reaching the other side of the minefield. You could do it that way. Or what is usually done is the minefield is cleared using very specific and specialized engineering equipment. You have systems that throw a line charge over a rough path in the minefield. It explodes. It's supposed to detonate and clear out, again, a rough path through the minefield. Then armored vehicles with plows and flails will work through there to attempt to detonate or clear any of the mines the line charge missed. And each time a vehicle goes in, it has to go back out the way it came. So the line charge is thrown. These tanks go in with their plows and flails to clear it out. They have to back up, and then a tank with a roller comes in and proofs the path to make sure that there are no mines remaining. Then the tank with the line charge, depending on how wide this minefield is, has to go down that path to the end of the path, shoot another line charge, and the process continues. And they have to continuously do that until they've cleared a path in the minefield. Now, before you do any of that, you need to create a buffer zone on the opposite end of the minefield of enemy forces, because if you don't, you're going to be under fire the entire time you're trying to do this procedure, this engineering work to clear the minefield. That means you need air power, artillery, rockets, missiles to wipe out everything that is potentially in range of this minefield while you clear it. And now this goes back to Desert Storm. I said I was going to talk about the US military in Iraq and how they cleared these minefields. We have documents like this, minefield breaching in Desert Storm. We have this from military.com. The bulldozer assault of Desert Storm saw the US Army opt out of trench warfare. And all of that was possible. That whole process of clearing the minefield, relatively unhindered, was possible because the United States had a massive advantage in terms of air power and long-range weapons like artillery, rockets, and missiles. They were able to wipe out any Iraqi units within range of the minefield, push them back, clear the minefield, and then have US and allied ground troops move through onto the other side and continue. Ukraine's problem is they don't have the ability to do this. They don't have an air force. They don't have the long-range weaponry needed to outgun and overpower Russian forces on the other side of that minefield. The problem is that Russia has a much larger number and variety of weapon systems that can target that minefield that Ukraine can do nothing about. They're going to have to cross the minefield under fire. Russia has, again, huge amounts of artillery. General Zaluzhny himself says that they're outgunned 10 to 1. Russia has anti-tank guided missiles. These are used by infantry that carry them around. They're mounted on vehicles. They're also mounted on helicopters, military aviation. Speaking of military aviation, Russia has warplanes that they can use to target troop concentrations along the line of contact. They have multiple launch rocket systems, they have drones, and of course all the small arms, fire, and large caliber weapons, and even tanks that might be in the area, in the security zone operating. Ukraine would need to clear all of that out, which is simply impossible. The Grad multiple launch rocket system, the most basic MLRS Russia has a range of about 50 kilometers. Smerch multiple launch rocket systems have a range of up to 120 kilometers, and there's a guided rocket version of the Smerch called Tornado S that has a range of up to 200 kilometers. They have the Lancet kamikaze drone that has a range of about 40 kilometers. These teams are very small. They set up, they launch the drone, they hit their target, and they leave. It's very hard to detect and eliminate. Ukraine needs to clear a buffer zone on the opposite end of the minefield, but they have no ability to do so. So they have to try to breach these minefields while under fire by all of these a significant number and quantity of Russian weaponry. Ukraine has artillery, they have HIMARS, they have their own drones, and they have been targeting and destroying Russian artillery, other long-range weapon systems, troops operating in the security zone, just like just like Wall Street Journal suggested. But again, as General Zaluzhny said, they're outgunned 10 to 1. So their ability to make it safe to clear these minefields does not exist. They do not have the ability to do this. Because of all of this, because of the reality on the ground, the nature of Russia's defenses, the nature of the size of their forces and the capability of their forces, and the nature of these minefields, and Ukraine's inability to clear them without being under heavy fire while doing so, means there is no version of this story where Ukraine's offensive breaks through multiple layers of defenses, seizes territory, and still has an army left to consolidate control over it. This is what I have been saying for months before the offensive was even launched. No matter where it ends on the map, it's going to end with Ukraine needing a new army and NATO being now at this point unable to provide them with yet another army. This is the third army that NATO has transferred over to Ukraine. There's no fourth army NATO has to transfer over to Ukraine. This is all a result of the very fact that this is a large-scale, intense war of attrition that Russia prepared for years in advance and the West did not. It's as simple as that. It took years for Russia to prepare itself for this conflict. It would take years for the West to be prepared for a conflict like this. They do not have years. They're working on expanding military-industrial production in the West. It'll take years just to match the rate of fire of artillery Ukraine is using on the battlefield right now, which is still far less than Russia. Andrei Martyanov explained in a recent video, a very excellent video titled Logistics, 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 which I will link to in the video description below. He talks about the fundamentals involved in this proxy war the US is waging on Russia and Ukraine, about military industrial production and the amount of weapons being produced by both sides and the quality of the weapons produced on both sides. Even if the West was able to produce their weapon systems on a larger scale, their capabilities do not match those of the Russian Federation. The Patriot missile system is not an S-300, it's not an S-400 system. The ATACMS is a rough analog of the Russian Iskander missile complex, but it is not as capable and is not as numerous as the Iskander. The HIMARS is not a Tornado S. It is an effective weapon, but it is not suitable for this type of combat. Same goes for the M777 howitzer. It was never designed to be used in this type of conflict. It was meant to be highly mobile and used as fire support fighting irregular forces in a developing country that the US invaded and was plundering. It was never meant to fight a peer or near peer competitor with artillery systems designed for huge volumes of fire. What can the US do to turn things around in Ukraine if doing it militarily really isn't an option? We've heard the US and their allies talking about increasingly dangerous and desperate options, like getting involved directly, intervening directly, NATO using its air power to give Ukraine the air cover it needs to clear these minefields, for example, or creating a buffer zone in Western Ukraine like the US did in Syria. But the US has tried these things in the past and they didn't work then, and they're unlikely to work now. We are also seeing a new iteration of the WMD Iraq lie. They lied about WMDs, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to serve as a pretext to invade Iraq in 2003. During the US proxy war against Syria, they not only lied about the Syrian government using chemical weapons, they also staged chemical weapon attacks to blame on the Syrian government. And now we're seeing articles like this in The Guardian. Russia reducing its presence at nuclear plant, says Ukraine. Staff at Zaporozhye told to relocate, says Ukrainian intelligence, as Moscow accused of explosion plot. This is the nuclear power plant that Ukraine has been shelling for months in front of the eyes of the entire world, trying to destroy, trying to create a catastrophe so that they can internationalize the conflict and give the West a pretext to intervene directly, just like Syria. It didn't work in Syria. It's unlikely to work in Ukraine. So these are tired, desperate, and extremely dangerous options being discussed because all other options have failed. There's only one other option that the US and their allies could choose, and that's the exit ramp. But if they choose that, their war that they are planning to provoke with China is off. They will never be able to build the consensus needed for sanctions or military intervention against China if they cannot even win their proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. So things are extremely desperate. I think they've never been as desperate and as dangerous as now. We'll have to keep a very close eye on all of this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. If you're watching this on YouTube, I have had videos of mine recently deleted. Politically motivated censorship on YouTube, which is only going to spread and expand. So if you watch my videos primarily on YouTube, please think about migrating over to, say, Telegram. I upload all of my videos now on Telegram in their entirety. You can watch them on Telegram. They're also all uploaded on Rumble and Odyssey. So please think about following my work there. I think it's only inevitable that YouTube eventually deletes my channel. So please think about a secondary platform to follow my work on. Again, Telegram is where I post absolutely everything. Short articles, comments, images, and also full-length videos and articles. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel, so if an ad pops up, please feel free to skip it. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month to month, through one-time donations, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there, I greatly appreciate that. That's what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.